So a very warm welcome to everybody to the NSF April 2018 webinar that I've put together this afternoon really to help everybody change their lives a little from the kind of reactive, difficult, tumultuous world that we live in to something that's maybe a little bit more proactive, that involves more planning, that involves you actually averting disasters and crises rather than just allowing them to happen to you. And I'm going to spend about half an hour with you this afternoon talking through some background to pharmaceutical quality risk management, how it can help you, some of the tools that you can employ, how we can actually support your key processes in not just maintaining CGMP, but also running those processes in a way that allows you to feel confident that you're going to be able to supply pharmaceutical products on time, in full, to schedule, with as little heartache and heartburn as possible along the way. We're really pleased to put this webinar together for you. We're really delighted that this is the third consecutive webinar that I've produced this year that has been booked out. So we've actually been able to fill all of the available slots, and we're really glad you're here listening to us this afternoon. So a couple of introductions to NSF. I know that you're aware of our company. We are a leading GMP consultancy. We are specifically expert in specialist training, largely associated with either key parts of the pharmaceutical quality system across sterols, non-sterols, oral solid dosage forms, across the various technologies that we employ in the Pharma Biotech world. Specifically, of course, we do a lot of EU qualified person training and GMP-specific training. Of course, that leads us as well to perform a number of assignments in preparing sites for various regulatory inspections via auditing, gap analysis, training, and consultancy. And generally, our work involves transformational projects that are going to take you to a new place in terms of either operability, cost control, delivery on time, or obviously CGMP compliance. I think some of you on the webinar today will already know something about me. I'm John Johnson. I'm Vice President at NSF Health Sciences, and this slide just gives a very brief introduction to my background and expertise in this area. And the reason I put the photograph in the top right there is that many people would think that fly fishing for salmon is a very passive sport, a sport that depends on serendipity and good luck, and if you're lucky, a fish will come along and attach itself and pull your string really, really tight. But in fact, you have to be proactive to be a salmon angler. You need to plan, you need to set your strategy, you need to work out places to focus your attention, and I just thought that photograph showed some of the success that you can have if you're proactive in whatever you do, rather than just relying on good fortune. So, one of the key messages of this webinar is that there is a continuing need within our industry to be expert in prevention rather than reaction. There's a continuing need for us to be better at both identifying risks, evaluating those risks, and then mitigating those risks to an acceptable level. And what I'm showing here with the two journals is that pretty much every year we dedicate one of our journals to key tips and tools and groundbreaking articles on how to identify and mitigate risk better. And we're seeing from our clients that there's a continuing interest in this subject, particularly as we all know prevention is always better than cure, and a proactive quality management system is always going to be considerably better for your business in terms of efficiency cost control, and CGMP compliance, rather than just allowing things to happen to you and then react. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the alternative to being proactive. I'm going to talk a little bit about how ICHQ9 is defined and what it requires us to do. I'm also going to make a link, quite an interesting link to ICHQ10, the Pharmaceutical Quality System requirement, and how parts of ICHQ10 are absolute cornerstones in providing a proactive quality risk management process. So, what would I need to be expert in? What would I need to be demonstrably across in all aspects in order to show to a third party, a regulator or a client, that I'm actually proactive in my risk management? I'm going to talk very briefly about staff behaviours and how they are a critical factor in managing risk. But most of the webinar is going to focus on these 3 common tools that can be extremely useful in making your quality risk management process more proactive. And they are policy deployment, FMEA, and contamination control strategies. So I'm hoping those 3 tools will just give you an introduction to some of the most common best practice in this area. So, ultimately, what's the alternative to being proactive? Of course, nobody wants to live in a world of nasty surprises. Nobody wants to have that feeling that every time they open their laptop or go to a meeting or visit one of their manufacturing sites or affiliates, that there's going to be nasty surprises. But essentially, if you're not across quality risk management, you're leaving yourself open to nasty surprises, and that's not a great place to be. When you have this cycle of pain, it leads to a degree of institutional stress. It's putting your business under unnecessary stresses and strains that then ultimately determine a culture of short-termism leading to burnout often being a result of long and unpredictable working hours, and then of course you're continually reacting to short-term requirements requiring new initiatives, new ways of working, new communication strategies that very quickly as human beings we become very tired of. We have initiative fatigue, and that can lead to a real disengagement with your workforce and with your colleagues, because nobody wants to continually chop and change direction because of nasty surprises. If you see any of these symptoms in your workplace, then obviously you've got some work to do to improve the proactivity of your quality risk management system. And of course, ultimately, if you're not proactive and you're not identifying the risks ahead of inspections and technical visits and client visits, then you're at risk of censure from some of your key stakeholders. When you look at risks occurring in your organization, there's a very common life cycle that we go through when we try to deal with these types of surprises. And this is almost a continuum, I would say. First of all, you have that moment of discovery. And normally those discoveries are not pleasant. They don't tend to be happy discoveries. They tend to be surprises that are going to affect your ability to maintain GMP, hit a timeline, hit a certain yield, or be able to supply a client or patient with their incredibly and highly desired and highly valued product. And that always leads to a degree of Macaulay Culkin, a degree of disbelief, denial, anger. And sometimes, we see then that a firm has this happen to them so often, they get into a place of stasis where they're actually petrified to make an assessment, to work on the mitigation strategy and to do something about it for the long term. And that can be an incredibly difficult place to be because you're not seeing any improvement. It can sometimes take a while to work through the stasis to move into acceptance, evaluation, planning, and then obviously carrying out the corrective and preventive actions and ultimately verifying their effectiveness. So often we see that the companies who are reactive in their quality risk management remain in a place of discovery, disbelief, and stasis. So, what does ICH-Q9 require us to do? The first thing it requires us to do, of course, is to be proactive, scientific, to use data, to use information from our pharmaceutical quality system, and to be logical and structured in the way that we work. And structure is really important within ICH-Q9 because it enables a mechanism or a process to be fulfilled. That process surrounding identification, evaluation, assessment, understanding true root cause, and then actually taking action. Critically, this should be an action-based process. It's no good understanding the risks and doing nothing about them. It's a matter of deciding which risks you're going to tackle and then tackle them with an undeniable amount of force, an undeniable amount of resources and focus and intelligence to actually reduce the severity, the occurrence, or improve the detectability of any future recurrence. So pharmaceutical quality risk management is actually all about, first and foremost, and absolutely critically, no apologies for saying this again, you have to know your process. You have to know the reality of your process. That's not just knowing what it says in your policies, your procedures, your manufacturing instructions, but knowing from the shop floor how, in reality, that job is actually done. From that deep understanding of what's actually happening, you then have to identify what is truly important, what is actually going to require your focus, what things are going to actually provide assurance of the quality attributes of your product that then will assure the quality and safety of that product and its interaction with your patient or end user. So this is all about knowledge, it's about funneling, and it's about focusing on what's really important. When you look at the flowchart in ICH-Q9, as shown here on slide 9, you can see that there are a number of steps, just 3 steps really in the process, and that's actually surrounding assessment, control, and then risk review. And I just draw your attention to the 2 that I find most important and often pretty difficult to control or to manage effectively. The first one is risk identification, right here at the top. If you don't have an effective risk identification process, you're not going to see things that are occurring out there that are going to undermine the ability of your team to run a successful business or quality system. So if you're not looking, you're not going to find. If you don't look and find, you can't fix. So you have to have an extremely sophisticated surveillance system looking out for risks. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that surveillance system on the next slide. But my key message here is, if you're not looking hard for risk, then you're only going to leave yourself open to reactivity. The second key message here is on risk reduction. So this is your fulfillment of the CAPA plan. So once you've gone through the process of identifying, analysing and evaluating risk, you then decide, utilising a scoring system, which of those risks you're then going to work on. And it is absolutely crucial that you decide on the most important risks and then follow through and complete those actions to a degree that you're comfortable that they have added value to your quality system and that you can verify by a variety of techniques that those risk reduction steps that you took have been effective in improving your business. So the key messages here are identification and then actually taking action. So if we then do a segue into ICH-Q10, What would you say are the key parts of the pharmaceutical quality system that we need to excel in order to be excellent at proactive risk management? And I've made a list in the table here for you. And each of these, it's just as you scan your eye through these, each of these are there to either identify risk in advance, to provide you with an insight, an internal level of insight that provides you with a signal or an indicator that something needs to be improved. And then, of course, you can then add that knowledge, that insight, into the flowchart we showed on slide 9 from ICHQ9 and take some action to reduce risk. And each of these, as you flick through, are critical in your pharmaceutical quality system. If you were to audit against these, how effective are they? Are they really giving you the insight on what can go wrong so that you can mitigate those things before they actually happen? And of course, the best companies in the world, the ones that are most proactive, are excellent at management review, they're excellent at auditing, they are intimately involved in quality assurance at the shop floor level, they manage CAPA incredibly well and follow through and verify effectiveness, they're superb at root cause analysis, they undertake qualification and validation not just by generating mounds and mounds of paperwork. They focus on the key failure modes and they look to design out those failure modes prior to effective qualification and validation. And of course, ultimately, the best companies will invest in their people so that their people will find those risks ahead of them becoming crises. So this is a nice list of things that you need to excel at in order to be proactive. So, you may have all that, but you may still live in a world of firefighting. So what would be your top 6 to fix if you were going to try and reduce the amount of firefighting that you do? Well, the first thing is to make sure that your policies, procedures, systems and instructions, log sheets are all simple to follow, that they're logical, that they are error-proofed and made as straightforward as possible for your operators to follow. Second one, of course, is you want your users to buy into them. You want them to own those documents, and the most obvious way of doing that is to utilize their experience and their knowledge and their whole selves in actually writing their own policies, procedures and log sheets so that they take an absolute ownership for those documents themselves. Of course, you'll want to make sure that both internally and perhaps with a third party, you benchmark routinely all of your policies, procedures, systems, instructions and log sheets against the CGMP expectations and best practice, making sure you're doing what is proportionate, sustainable and as error-proofed as possible. You also want to be sure that you've developed a communication process, a management development process, an investigation process, and a basic way of working in your organization that avoids blame. By all means, you need to call out issues, you need to call out processes that are not performing, but you really want to make sure that people run towards issues to resolve them rather than run away from issues. And you have to exhibit a blame-free culture in order to really be proactive in your quality risk management process. Do you have a team that is able to use a variety of tools or a variety of techniques in finding all of the potential root causes? Not the most convenient root cause, not necessarily the first one that you come across, but all of the potential root causes. So that with the knowledge that you have to hand, you're able to identify the most effective CAPA to prevent recurrence. And ultimately, you want to make sure your staff are engaged in what you're trying to do, they are educated in what is required, and that you've got their full commitment to do the right thing and be proactive. I've shown this slide a couple of times before, no apologies for this, and we keep reminding everybody about how important behaviours are to making change and being proactive. So ultimately, behaviours are driven by motivation. Motivation driven by know why, not just know how. So taking the time in your education programs to be sure that people understand why it's important, why it has to be done, what will go wrong if things are not tackled. You have to give people the ability in order to make the right decisions and the right changes and be proactive in preventing issues. Fundamentally, you need your processes to be made as easy as possible to do the right thing and as tough as possible to do the wrong thing. You obviously want your SOPs and your posters and your communications and your instructions to act as effective triggers. Eye-catching, attractive, short interval signals that make sure that the right thing is at the front of everybody's mind and that we don't just rely on institutional memory. And then ultimately, you want a high-performing team that learn from each other, that emulate each other, that do the right thing because it's natural and normal, and that they get into the swing or the rhythm of doing the right thing, and that change, for change's sake, is avoided as much as possible. Change management, obviously very important, but change for the sake of change is only ever going to cause issues reoccurring. So let's focus a little bit more on these three common tools. The first common tool is policy deployment, and I listed this one first because it allows you to actually organize your team in a way that provides focus and proactivity. So let's look at this. So policy deployment is essentially a structured approach to business improvement. It allows you to take the time with your team to focus on what is important. What is the brutal reality of your organization, your process, your production facilities, your QC regime and program. And it enables you to get perspectives from all of your team on what the brutal reality of the performance is. It enables you to work out what's important to the performance of the organization. You get to filter out the key things that will happen if I did nothing. If I didn't focus my time on this, what would go wrong? Who would notice? How would this affect the business? You also get a deep connection with how this might affect you as an individual, your family, your patient base, or your team, your organization. So it really gives you a good understanding of know why. And ultimately, this leads then to a very classic methodology of SWOT analysis. So strengths, understanding your strengths, weaknesses, threats, and opportunities. And of course, threats are the risks. And these are the risks that you want to be able to codify in a way that enables you to set effective objectives and set your resources to fix the things of most importance. So ultimately, policy deployment is all about an integrated, user-centered process for defining your vision, values, and mission based on your risks and priorities, and helping you organizationally to develop plans and then deploy those resources to make sure that you make meaningful change. And it's amazing how many times we visit companies who have no knowledge of their risks, therefore have no knowledge of their priorities, and have a very rudimentary set of objectives or an annual quality plan which is not linked to reducing risk in their organization. So they really miss a trick. So let's look at this as a pipeline. The first thing that you do in policy deployment is work with your team to define your vision. What do you want to be? What do you want us to be? How do you want the organization to look? And to hear, often via voice of the customer, to hear exactly what your clients and partners expect you to be. You then take knowledge, insight, observations from your pharma quality system, your internal audits, your corporate quality audits, your client audits, your regulatory audits, your knowledge of the quality system and your shop floor QA, utilizing your quality system, quality risk management, employing your values so that you get both the logic, the head, the intuition, the heart, and the institutional knowledge, the guts, to actually give you a view of what's really going on within your organisation. And you feed this into a pipe. And the first thing to do when you have all of that knowledge, from your qualification processes, your auditing processes, your periodic quality reviews, and all of your other surveillance processes that we mentioned surrounding ICHQ 10, you then do a SWOT analysis. And you have to have that blame-free culture where you can call out the uncomfortable realities and really understand in full the threats. You then take those threats and you assess them. You assess them using the ICHQ9 tools, and you put some degree of scoring according to their severity to your company, the frequency that they may occur, and how easy they are to detect. And that enables you then to do a risk ranking that gives you a risk register. And knowing what's at the top of that risk register will then actually enable you to work out exactly how you're going to tackle those things at the top of the filtered risk register, so that you can develop a 3-year plan, a mission, which then is refined and funneled into your annual quality plan, which is then linked to your resource plan, remembering there's no point in writing a quality plan if you don't have the resources to fulfill it. So let's be realistic here. If you have a finite amount of resources, you may have to make the selection of your risk mitigation projects according to the available resource. So the integration between your quality plan and your resource plan is absolutely critical. As is, of course, the integration with your training plan, because you have to have the knowledge and expertise within your team to fulfill the resource needs and to fulfill the mitigation strategies and objectives. And of course, ultimately, that filters down into site objectives, individual objectives, an annual operating budget, and then ultimately key performance indicators on a dashboard, a balanced scorecard, and some form of progress review process or management review process. But I'm hoping that you can see from that table that these things are all linked together. And if you can actually be excellent at filling the pipeline with knowledge, insight, and brutal reality, and that you're good at assessing the risks and coming up with a ranking system, you can then very easily develop each of these outputs that focuses on risk reduction. So let's look at a second tool here as well, FMEA. So this is obviously used to map processes, deepen understanding of what goes wrong, and then decide on areas for improvement. And I've done a kind of comparison here on slide 18 between HACCP and FMEA. So they are quite different, but they're also very complementary and used sometimes in the same arenas, sometimes in quite contrasting arenas. But let's look at the comparison. Both of them require a deep understanding of the product and the process, and mapping of the product and process is really useful here. HACCP requires you to understand the hazards and the ways of controlling those hazards, whether it's continuous monitoring, whether it's in-process checks and controls. It depends on the process. But it then enables you to understand the critical control points that assure the quality attributes of your products. It allows you to set limits, sampling regimes, and some form of monitoring system for each critical control point. Contrasting that with FMEA, once you've mapped the process, you're able to then brainstorm the possible failure modes, what can go wrong, what the effects are, do a risk ranking, and then decide how you're going to mitigate and reassess. So HACCP is a great method really in defining a process, in doing process development, in actually helping you define an effective process, defining your in-process checks. How do you work out what is a useful IPC and what is a non-value-adding IPC? Similarly, what points should you be taking samples from your process, and what types of samples and what types of tests would be best needed, are all very helpfully justified by using HACCP to define your process which can then, of course, then be developed, validated, and some form of continued process verification regime set up based on your knowledge from this particular tool. Contrasting this with FMEA, once you understand the process, enables you to really deep dive into root cause of problems, helping your staff understand and be educated by the vulnerabilities within your process, helps you to simplify processes, reduce risk, and it can be a fantastic tool in making a very visual output on whether your process is under control, at risk, high risk, or low risk, and enabling your staff using that visual tool to see those risks at a glance. And that can be an incredibly powerful training tool, particularly for new staff. So, when you think about FMEA, of course, the key steps here are going to be the Gemba, actually going to the shop floor and seeing how it really works and how it really happens, not just trying to solve issues from behind a laptop, going to the shop floor and interacting with operators, engineers, production staff, analysts, whoever they may be. Gaining that deep understanding so that you can apply risk management, human error reduction, and fully knowing what's happening at the shop floor. When you look at some of those key steps, I've just shown here a swim lane diagram, just showing how you can develop a sequential process for defining your production process that then enables you very easily to see who is responsible for what, where the transactions are, where the handoffs are, where's the complications, where are the gaps and omissions, and ultimately where are the risks in your overall process. And of course you can either do this as a swim lane diagram or by some form of exploded visual graphic like I've shown in the blister packaging process visual just there. So what about contamination control? Well, this is a very topical subject at the moment because it's going to be made much, much more explicit that there will be a requirement for a contamination control strategy in the manufacture of sterile products. But I want to kind of expand it beyond that because this is a superb tool in actually identifying risks and mitigating risks for any type of contamination, for any type of dosage form. So when you look at the 15 different sections within the recommended contamination control strategy from Annex 1, the new draft Annex 1 that is, yet to be approved, you can see that in column 1 there are going to be 15 sections for you to consider in your contamination control strategy. We would recommend there would be some form of single owner for each of these sections of the document, leading a multidisciplinary team, that there would be a range of highly defined surveillance and risk identification methods that you would utilize to identify any risks in each of these sections. You would then have a description of each risk in turn, a scoring system as described in ICHQ 9, and then ultimately, according to the ranking of each of those risks, some form of smart kappa and effectiveness check. So it doesn't really matter what type of contamination you're trying to preempt and identify and be proactive against. These 15 sections could be applied to any dosage form. And I'm just going to give you a few seconds to look at the types of sections within Annex 1, the types of surveillance processes, and the types of risk and risk management processes you would go through. But these 15 sections would really cover a huge amount of the key sources of contamination within your particular process. Okay, so ultimately, the CCS, the Contamination Control Strategy, is a really nice proactive tool that would help you identify and mitigate risks from either chemical contamination, so cross-contamination, admixtures, cleaning verification related issues, Also, to mitigate risk of non-viable contamination, so typically contaminants that may adulterate your product, such as dirt, dust, metal shavings, gaskets, and that type of thing, or indeed from microbial contamination, as it would be for either low bioburden or sterile products. So ultimately, the CCS allows you to evaluate the design of your overall quality system, your facilities, and be proactive in risk prevention. So, I draw your attention again to those 15 sections. Very, very useful to put together a proactive document that shows how those risks have been identified, how you mitigate them, and what further improvements you may take. So ultimately, of course, NSF can help you in managing risk better, in identifying risk, doing gap analysis, and helping you to focus your resources to make the best possible changes, to essentially make you, your department, and your organization the very best version of itself. And we are experts at managing you through this change curve, all the way from discovery to internalization of the change and ongoing improvements. We have a range of training courses in this sphere, and I'll just draw your attention to two that are occurring this year, specifically on quality risk management, one in York in June and one in September in Manchester. So we'll be delighted to see you on those courses. My next webinar, which I hope will be the fourth consecutive sellout for me, will be on May the 15th, and I'll be talking about behavioural GMP and how you can use that to be sure that you're ready for any future GMP inspection, whether that's either via a client inspection or a regulatory inspection. And I'll be going through some of the key tools that will help you prepare for that future inspection. So I hope you can join me for that. I hope this has been useful. Keep in touch with us. I've put together some links there for you that may be of great interest in terms of our resources and our videos and on changing behaviours. But in any case, call me, drop me an email. Be delighted to hear from you. Hopefully that was of some use, and hope to see you again.